Adolf Hitler never concealed his belief that the Soviet Union would be the final enemy of his regime. He hated communism and viewed the vast open spaces and abundant natural resources of Soviet Russia as the prize that would finally allow the German people to become the master race. Throughout the early months of 1941, while staying at the Berghof, his countryside retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler planned his greatest gamble, Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union. His armies were gradually redeployed to the east and re-equipped for what would be their greatest challenge. In theory, Stalin's Soviet Union was still Hitler's ally, and Stalin was eager to keep it that way, as his country was woefully unprepared for war. On July 6, 1940, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler celebrated his victory in Europe. His army chief called him the greatest warlord in history. From Moscow, Hitler's collaborator, Russian leader Joseph Stalin, sent his congratulations. In London, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was isolated. In Washington, American President Franklin Roosevelt kept his distance. In the next 5 years, everything in the relationship between these four men would change in ways that once seemed unimaginable. While their nations fought a war of arms, these four great warlords of the 20th century waged a mental war. What began as a European war developed into a war for global domination. At the heart of this private war was a series of psychological duels in which they lied, schemed, charmed, flattered, and deceived to win. Interestingly, these duels did not occur between enemies, but between men who at the time were allies. Yet their behavior was selfish, tempestuous, monstrous, and politically, despite the romantic glow in which some are viewed today, always self-serving. Over Salzburg, in southern Germany, one of the most beautiful places in the world, it was here in August 1939 that Adolf Hitler contemplated the unthinkable. Hitler had decided to invade Poland, and his generals told him he had to attack before the autumn rains arrived. But Britain and France had declared they would go to war for Poland. One thing stood in Hitler's way: the fear that Russia would also turn against him and push him into a two-front war. This was exactly what had been imprinted on Hitler's mind as something that helped Germany lose the First World War 20 years earlier. There was only one way out: a pact with his greatest ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin. Hitler made an approach to Moscow, although he had little idea that he was initiating a mental duel with Stalin that would, over the next 2 years, decide the fate of World War II. Stalin was deeply suspicious of Hitler's approach. He spent hours reading Mein Kampf, written 15 years earlier, underlining key passages, such as Hitler's opinions about the Bolshevik leaders, men like Stalin himself. Never forget that the rulers of present-day Russia are common blood-soaked criminals who are the scum of humanity. But Stalin could see that Hitler was now desperate for a deal and offered to send his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, to Moscow. Stalin decided to go along with Hitler. Hitler's propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, wrote in his diary on August 22, 1939, "Non-aggression pact with Moscow. Perfect. Ribbentrop in Moscow on Wednesday. We're on top again. Now we can sleep more peacefully." On August 23rd, Ribbentrop landed in Moscow, but Hitler needed some form of assurance. He sent his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, to film Stalin's earlobes to see whether they were attached, and Jewish or detached, and Aryan. They were detached. Stalin passed Hitler's test. Shortly after midnight on August 24, 1939, the Nazi-Soviet pact was signed, and with it, a secret protocol under which Germany and Russia would divide Poland in two. Hitler phoned Ribbentrop. "This will hit like a bombshell." But as Goebbels observed, it was not strength, but fear of Stalin stabbing him in the back that forced Hitler to make the greatest reversal in history. The Führer believes he is in a position of begging for favors, and beggars can't be choosers in times of hunger. The devil feeds on flies. In the Kremlin, Stalin proposed a toast. "I know how much the German nation loves its Führer, therefore I would like to drink to his health." But like Hitler, Stalin was also acting out of fear that Hitler would attack him. That night, he told his inner circle, "Of course it's all a game to see who can deceive whom. He thinks he outwitted me, but in fact, I'm the one who deceived him." Stalin found a partner whose cunning he had long secretly admired. In 1934, Stalin had watched Hitler eliminate rivals within the Nazi Party in the so-called Night of the Long Knives. He commented, "Did you hear what happened in Germany? That fellow Hitler, splendid. That's a feat of some skill." Hitler did not feel such mutual admiration in his early years in power. He was focused on the dreams of Mein Kampf, an alliance with the British Maritime Empire, while he expanded eastward to build his German land empire on the continent. Only when that plan clearly failed did Hitler begin to see in Stalin someone he could do business with. Stalin was the first of the two to become a mass murderer. His terrors killed millions. He compared his victims to the massacred landowning boyars by Ivan the Terrible 400 years earlier. Who will remember all this rabble in 10 or 20 years? No one. Who remembers the names of the boyars whom Ivan the Terrible eliminated? No one. A week before invading Poland, Hitler made a strangely similar comment to his generals. Genghis Khan killed millions of men and women by his own will and with a cheerful heart. History sees him only as a great state builder. And who, after all, speaks today of the extermination of the Armenians? For both men, mass murder was just another weapon in the ideological struggle. The state, whether communist or Nazi, was supreme. Individuals were its disposable tools. They even extended this idea to their private lives. Hitler had secret lovers, chiefly Eva Braun, but in public no woman could come between him and his nation. One of his secretaries recalled that he repeatedly emphasized, "My lover is Germany." Stalin married twice and had children, but the suicide of his second wife, Nadezhda, in 1932, further brutalized him. Echoing Hitler, he said to an associate, "A true Bolshevik must not and cannot have a family because he must devote himself entirely to the party." Stalin told his son, Vasily, "I am not Stalin. Stalin is Soviet power." Now, in August 1939, these two great ideologically opposed warlords were inextricably linked. 8 days after the pact was signed, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain declared war. Winston Churchill returned to the British cabinet. Stalin publicly supported his Nazi collaborator. He told the world, "It is not Germany that attacked England and France, but England and France that attacked Germany." The enslavement of Poland further united the two extreme proponents of totalitarian violence. SS units killed 60,000 Jews and members of the Polish ruling class. It was Hitler's first experience with mass murder, and it deeply influenced him. It showed him that his followers would actually do it. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, long accustomed to mass killings, carried out similar massacres in eastern Poland. Among their victims were more than 20,000 Polish officers and political prisoners, whose bodies would be discovered 3 years later. While their secret police mutilated Poland, the two dictators faced their fates hand in hand. Over the next 2 years, in a mental war without parallel in world history, both would become trapped in a series of illusions that would lead them to colossal errors and to the bloodiest conflict ever fought. Stalin had entered his pact with Hitler with open eyes. He never doubted he was dealing with the devil, but believed the pact would bring the Soviet Union both protection and opportunity. Just 1 week after the Nazis invaded Poland, he told his inner circle, "A war is underway between two groups of capitalist countries. Hitler, without realizing or wanting to, is shaking and undermining the capitalist system. We can maneuver, play one side against the other, make them fight each other as fiercely as possible. Stalin also had his eye on one additional desirable outcome: the chance to expand his communist empire. What would be the harm if, as a result of Poland's defeat, we extended the socialist system to new territories and populations? For Hitler, the pact also opened the door to conquest. He could now concentrate all his energy and attention on planning the invasion of France. Joseph Goebbels noted Hitler's hopes for a long-term collaboration with Stalin on October 1, 1939. Conference with the Führer. Privately, he is convinced of Russia's loyalty. After all, Stalin is about to make an enormous profit. But Stalin did not see such loyalty in Hitler. Mein Kampf was etched in his mind. Above all, Hitler's youthful ambitions to conquer Russian territory for the new German Reich. If we talk about territory in Europe today, we can only think of Russia and its vassal border states. Because he calculated that Hitler could still one day turn against him, Stalin began building a line of buffer zones to protect himself against a possible Nazi attack. He forced the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, to accept Russian garrisons. He told a Latvian delegation, "There was an unexpected turn, but it cannot be trusted. We must be prepared in time. Others who were not prepared paid for it. The Germans may attack." Stalin also tried to intimidate Finland into ceding him a strip of territory as additional protection. The Finns refused. Stalin invaded their country. It was a disaster. Within days, thousands of frozen Russian corpses covered the snow. Eventually, the Finns were defeated, but not before killing 125,000 Russian soldiers. Stalin sent his political commissars to shoot Soviet commanders, but the real fault was his. His terror had eliminated the best officers of the Red Army. As Goebbels noted, the incompetence of the Red Army offered even more comfort to Hitler on March 15, 1940. "The Russians can never become dangerous to us. If Stalin shoots his own generals, we won't need to. So far, we've had only advantages from our alliance with Russia." On May 10, 1940, with his Eastern Front secured by Stalin, Hitler launched his blitzkrieg to the west. The German army swept through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The British were expelled from the continent. For Hitler, it was a triumph. For Stalin, a disaster. Nikita Khrushchev, later Russia's prime minister, recalled Stalin's reaction to Hitler's lightning victories. "I remember being with Stalin. He was extremely nervous. He paced back and forth, cursing like a taxi driver. He cursed the French, cursed the British. How could they allow Hitler to defeat and crush them?" Stalin not only saw the superiority of the German army, he knew the Germans perceived our weakness because of the war we had waged with Finland. On June 17, 1940, the French government sued for peace. The long and mutually destructive war of the capitalist and fascist states that Stalin had so eagerly anticipated was over in an instant. The next day, while Hitler celebrated in Munich with the Italian dictator Mussolini, Stalin, with clenched teeth, sent his congratulations for the splendid success of the Wehrmacht. For Hitler, the victory had healed a wound. Germany's defeat in the First World War had been avenged. Now, for the first time in his political life, he wanted a break from conquest and, reverting to his old instincts, peace with Britain. The Italian foreign minister, Ciano, was also in Munich and observed Hitler's state of mind. Italy makes many reservations about the desirability of dismantling the British Empire, which he still considers today an important factor in world balance. Hitler is now like a gambler who, having made a big win, would like to leave the table, risking nothing further. But Stalin feared that Hitler, having secured his victory in the West, might soon be tempted by his old ambition to expand to the east. Stalin then embarked on a double and extremely risky strategy. to make a series of territorial acquisitions to expand and protect his empire while trying not to provoke Hitler. He occupied the Baltic states and Bessarabia, the northern province of Romania. This was permitted under the Nazi-Soviet pact. But he also decided to invade another Romanian province, Bukovina. This was not allocated to Stalin under the pact. Hitler's chief of staff, General Franz Halder, noted Hitler's concern in his diary on June 25, 1940. The issue of Bukovina raised by Russia is new and goes beyond our agreements with the Russians. At this exact moment, Stalin's duel with Hitler took a second unexpected turn. The Soviet leader received his first letter from Winston Churchill, who had become British Prime Minister the day Hitler launched his blitzkrieg. It was an appeal for Stalin to be wary of Hitler and join the British side. Stalin did not respond. Instead, to show Hitler his loyalty, he informed Berlin of Churchill's approach. Hitler now began to form his own interpretation of these two pieces of evidence: Stalin's opacity in Romania and Churchill's approach. Before the war, Hitler had described his secret mental processes to his aide. "Remember that my brain works like a calculating machine. Every person who makes a presentation to me introduces into this calculating machine a small wheel of information. A certain image or number is formed on each wheel. I press a button, and the sum of all this information appears in my mind." Now, Hitler's calculating machine began building a conspiracy theory that would have devastating consequences. On July 6, 1940, Hitler, the victor of Europe, returned to Berlin for a hero's welcome. Our wonderful July sun shines everywhere. Unimaginable ecstasy fills the city. The crowd roars. The station seems like a great banquet hall. Then the train arrives. A roar of joy fills the station. That day, Hitler's army chief, General Keitel, called him the greatest military leader in history. But amid his triumph, Hitler was increasingly tormented by a prevailing thought. In his view, he had won the war, so why didn't the British acknowledge this fact and make peace with him? He began to convince himself that there must be some external factor in which Britain and Churchill were placing their hope. A week after the Day of Glory in Berlin, General Halder recorded a key development in Hitler's reasoning. July 13, 1940. The Führer is very puzzled by Britain's persistent reluctance to make peace. He sees the answer in Britain's hope in Russia. On July 19, 1940, in a speech to the Reichstag, Hitler made his last peace offer to Britain. Churchill and the British were not interested. Later that day, another piece of information from the United States entered Hitler's mind. Franklin Roosevelt was nominated by the Democratic Party to run for president for a third term. His acceptance speech contained an attack on Nazi aggression. Hitler was now seeing specters around the world. July 22, 1940. Führer's vision: reasons for Britain's continuation of the war. 1. Waiting for a change in America. 2. Places hope in Russia. Stalin is flirting with Britain to keep it in the war. Hitler retreated to the mountains of Obersalzberg. The illusion was growing. Here, the previous summer, he had been dreaming of his pact with Stalin. Now he suspected him. At the end of July, he announced to his generals the result of weeks of agonizing reflection. July 31, 1940, 11:30 a.m. The Führer concludes that Russia is the factor in which Britain most trusts. Something must have happened in London. The British were completely defeated. Now they are encouraged again. With Russia crushed, Britain's last hope would be destroyed. The sooner Russia is crushed, the better. If we start in May 1941, we would have 5 months to finish the job. It was still just an idea, but two massive illusions: the first that he had already won the war, and the second that some secret deal was being made between Britain and Russia, were leading Hitler down the path to catastrophe. For Hitler, the invasion of Russia was still just a contingency plan in case all other means of forcing the British to make peace failed. The autumn of 1940 now brought 4 long months of frustration. The RAF defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Plans for an invasion across the English Channel were quietly shelved. Yet, despite these setbacks, Hitler deluded himself that he had done enough. October 15, 1940. Führer on the military situation. The war is won. The rest is a mere matter of time. But Hitler still could not force the British to make a deal, and he was torn regarding Russia, moving troops closer to its borders while also wanting Stalin to join him in the fight against Britain. Hitler's aide, Major Gerhard Engel, noted in his diary, November 4, 1940. Führer, visibly depressed, gives the impression that at the moment he does not know how things should proceed. Then came the defining moment. On November 12, 1940, the Soviet Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, arrived in Berlin at Hitler's invitation. Molotov received all the Nazi pomp, but the ensuing talks were tense. Hitler's purpose in summoning Molotov was to offer Russia a share of the spoils of victory if it helped defeat the British. He told him, "The final capitulation of England is only a matter of time. Fragments of its empire will be left all over the world. It is time to think about the vision of this property without a master after our victory." But Stalin was not interested in joining Hitler's war or in speculative divisions of the British Empire. His instructions to Molotov were to find out what Hitler's troops were doing in Finland and Romania, places right on his doorstep. Molotov asked the questions directly. Hitler gave vague answers. Despite the superficial courtesies, Molotov's arrogant coldness and insistence on the issue of territory in Eastern Europe enraged and reinvigorated Hitler. November 15, 1940. The talks showed where Russian plans were heading. Molotov let it slip. The Führer was truly relieved. It wouldn't even be a marriage of convenience. When Molotov reported the talks in Berlin to Moscow, Stalin realized Hitler was turning against him. In early December, he told his generals, "We know that Hitler is intoxicated by his victories and believes the Red Army will need at least 4 years to prepare for war. Obviously, 4 years would be more than enough for us, but we must be ready much sooner. We will try to delay the war by 2 more years." But Hitler was moving at a speed that Stalin could not imagine. On December 18, 1940, he issued War Directive Number 23. The German army must be prepared before the end of the war against England to crush Soviet Russia in a rapid campaign. The invasion date was set for May 1941. But behind the order lay uncertainty. December 18, 1940. "I am convinced that the Führer himself does not know how this will turn out. He is very worried about the lack of clarity regarding the strength of the Russians. He expects an English surrender, does not believe that America will enter the war." Hitler finally made the momentous decision. A war on 2 fronts, the very thing he sought to avoid when he made his pact with Stalin. But he deluded himself into thinking that one front, Great Britain, was already defeated. One knockout blow against Russia would be enough for the British to understand their defeat. Hitler's reasoning never occurred to Stalin. He believed that Hitler had to defeat Churchill or make a deal with him before thinking of turning against Russia. At the beginning of 1941, he told members of the Politburo, "We must have no illusions. Fascist Germany is clearly preparing for an attack on the Soviet Union. Why does Hitler want to make a deal with England? Because he wants to avoid a war on 2 fronts." Stalin trusted that Hitler would act rationally, and fighting both Britain and Russia at the same time was clearly irrational. But Stalin failed to realize that, despite their similarities, there was a profound difference between him and Hitler, one that made his perfect logic irrelevant. He himself was a methodical, calculating, and hard-working man, a master of detail, personally signing execution lists on one hand, and on the other, keeping the minutiae of gold production recorded in his notebook. Hitler, on the other hand, was at heart a lazy dreamer. He once described why he loved the mountains of Obersalzberg. "When I go to Obersalzberg, I am not attracted only by the beauty of the landscape. I feel far from the small things. My imagination is stimulated. When I study a problem elsewhere, I see it less clearly. I am submerged by details. At night, in the Berghof, I often lie awake for hours, gazing from my bed at the moonlit mountains. It is in these moments that clarity comes to my mind." For Hitler, the great idea should never be interrupted by small facts, and having decided to attack Russia for tactical reasons, the original and greatest idea of all was reasserting itself: the ideological struggle against Jews and Bolsheviks. Throughout 1940, Hitler hardly mentioned the Jews, but on January 30th, 1941, in his traditional speech marking the anniversary of the Nazi rise to power, he repeated a terrifying threat he had made before the start of the war. In a series of conferences with his generals in the spring of 1941, Hitler made his objectives brutally clear. March 3, 1941. "The next campaign will lead to a confrontation between two different ideologies. The Jewish Bolshevik intelligentsia must be eliminated." March 30th, 1941. "We must forget the concept of comradeship among soldiers. This is a war of extermination." While Hitler planned his annihilation, Stalin still believed he had at least a year to prepare. On April 13th, 1941, he moved to protect his rear by signing a pact with Hitler's ally, Japan. Stalin was delighted with his move and became cheerfully drunk with the Japanese foreign minister, Matsuoka. But he still pursued his double strategy. When he bid farewell to Matsuoka, the German military attaché in Moscow was present. Stalin told him, "We must remain friends, and now you must do everything to that end. We will remain friends with you no matter what happens." But Stalin knew such long-term friendship was a fantasy. Soon after, he told graduates of the Moscow Military Academy, "There will be war, and the enemy will be Germany." Up to this point, Stalin's reasoning was impeccable. He foresaw the eventual conflict with Germany and was gradually preparing for it. But a bizarre twist would lead him into his own great delusion. In April 1941, Stalin received his second letter from Winston Churchill. Like the first, it would have an electrifying effect on his duel with Hitler. Churchill told him that the British had received intelligence reports about German troop movements that could only mean preparations for a Nazi attack on Russia. Stalin immediately became suspicious, not of Hitler, but of Churchill. He told his army chiefs, "Britain is threatening us with the Germans and threatening the Germans with the Soviet Union. They are playing us against each other." Then, on May 10, 1941, in one of the strangest moments of the war, Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, took off from Germany in a Messerschmitt fighter, flew across the North Sea, and parachuted into Scotland. At that time, Stalin's assistant present at his important meetings was Yuri Chadayev, who took notes and then typed everything Stalin said. From Chadayev's unpublished secret record, it is possible to reconstruct how Churchill's message and Hess's flight began to lead Stalin into a conspiracy theory that would have immensely destructive consequences for his country. 3 days after Hess's landing, Chadayev recorded the interpretation Stalin gave to these two events. On one hand, Churchill sends us a personal message warning us about Hitler's aggressive intentions, and on the other hand, the British receive Hess, who is undoubtedly Hitler's confidant. What is the conclusion then? Apparently, when Churchill sent us his personal warning, he believed we would activate our military machine. Then, Hitler would have a direct and just reason to launch a preemptive crusade against the Soviet Union. In Stalin's eyes, Churchill's warning was deliberately designed to provoke a war between Germany and Russia, and Churchill was meeting with Hess to tell Germany it should strike first. Reflecting on this idea, Stalin concluded that Churchill was not the only provocateur. June 5, 1941. England, France, and America see in Germany the only hope of getting rid of Bolshevism, and therefore help the Nazis in every possible way in their crusade to the east. This deduction, that the democratic nations of Europe and America were uniting against him, became a blinding article of faith. During May and June, intelligence reports gave warning after warning of an imminent German attack. Stalin dismissed them all as part of the grand conspiracy to provoke him. On June 12th, he told his generals, "I am sure that Hitler will not risk creating a second front by attacking the Soviet Union. Hitler is not an idiot." Millions of German troops gathered within striking distance of Russia's borders. Operation Barbarossa, as it was now called, was scheduled for 10 days later, June 22nd. The duel between Hitler and Stalin was nearing its end. As Operation Barbarossa approached, Hitler convinced himself that he was fulfilling his destiny. June 16, 1941, with 6 days remaining, he told Goebbels, "What we have fought against all our lives we will now annihilate. Whether right or wrong, we must win, and when we win, who will ask about the method?" That day, a Soviet spy in the Luftwaffe sent yet another warning of an imminent German attack. Stalin retorted, "Tell the source in the German Air Force General Staff to go to his mother." On June 18, 1941, Stalin's two top generals, Zhukov and Timoshenko, pleaded with him for a full alert. Stalin reminded them that Hitler could not attack without first making a deal with Britain. "You must understand that Germany will never fight Russia alone. You must understand that." On June 20, 1941, 2 days before, Hitler chose his victory fanfare, a passage from Liszt's symphonic poem Les Préludes. Although Stalin still refused to see the attack coming, it was now apparent to his closest associates that the Nazis were on their way. On June 21st, one of them, Georgy Dimitrov, was in Moscow. Rumors of an imminent attack were multiplying from all sides. "We need to be on alert," said Dimitrov. "I called Molotov this morning. Molotov says the situation is undefined. There is a big game in motion." On June 22, 1941, on the same day Napoleon had invaded Russia, Hitler followed in his footsteps. At 3:30 in the morning, the attack began, the largest deployment in world history. The Führer seems freed from a nightmare. The closer we get to the decisive moment, all his fatigue seems to vanish and give way to deep insight into his thoughts. We have no choice but to attack. This cancerous abscess must be cauterized. Stalin will fall. At 7 a.m., I, Georgy Dimitrov, was urgently summoned to the Kremlin. Germany has attacked the USSR. The war has begun. They attacked us without declaring any grievances, without demanding any negotiations. They attacked us ferociously, like gangsters. Stalin's grand conspiracy theory, that the democracies were scheming to provoke him, was shattered. His misreading of Hitler, the man he viewed as a rational strategist, was total. Hitler had completed an extraordinary mental journey. 1 year earlier, he had seen the invasion as a tactic to make Britain collapse. Now, the ideology he had embraced 20 years before was once again at the forefront. He wrote to his Italian ally, Benito Mussolini, "Let me say one more thing, Duce. Since I fought to arrive at this decision, I feel spiritually free again. The partnership with the Soviet Union was often very burdensome to me, as it somehow seemed to be a break with all my origins, my concepts, and my previous obligations. I am now glad to be relieved of those mental agonies." While Operation Barbarossa purified Hitler, It only shocked and depressed Stalin. His fury was directed equally at Hitler and at his own generals, whose deployment of forces, insisted upon by Stalin, had allowed the Germans to destroy Russian defenses. This is a monstrous crime. The responsible ones must lose their heads. NKVD units were sent to the front to arrest those responsible. The commander, General Pavlov, was executed by firing squad. 5 days later, Stalin remarked, "Lenin founded our state, and we have ruined it." The Red Army, caught off guard because Stalin refused to allow it to prepare, was in a chaotic retreat. 2 weeks after the invasion, General Halder noted in his diary, July 3, 1941. It is probably not an exaggeration to say that the Russian campaign was won within the space of 2 weeks. Militarily, Barbarossa turned the war upside down, and Stalin's experience with Hitler also had a vital psychological effect on him. He later commented, "When you are trying to make a decision, never put yourself in the mind of the other person, because if you do, you may make a terrible mistake." Stalin had lost the mental game. Hitler had outplayed him, but Hitler would be the eventual loser. His decision to attack Russia sealed the fate of his own imperial dreams and of European imperialism in general, and it would create an unlikely coalition of 3 ideologically opposed warlords to fight against him. The mighty Red Army, once the largest and most technologically advanced in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. About 3/4 of its senior officers had been executed or imprisoned. Despite appearances, there was a catastrophic collapse in morale and efficiency. As German soldiers invaded neighboring Poland, Stalin, desperate to maintain peace, gave orders that nothing should be done to offend Hitler. But Hitler had one more task to complete before advancing into Russia. He needed to secure his southern flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were firm allies of Germany, but in March 1941, the pro-German Yugoslav government was overthrown by pro-British forces. The nearby neighbor, Greece, was also pro-British. Thus, on April 6, 1941, the German army invaded the Balkans. 33 German divisions moved into Yugoslavia, quickly destroying its defenses. The capital, Belgrade, surrendered on April 12th. Greece fell almost as quickly. Despite British assistance, Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks. The path was now clear for Operation Barbarossa. Over 4 million men were mobilized, supported by more than 3,000 aircraft. The plan called for 3 simultaneous thrusts. Army Group North would overrun the Baltic states and take Leningrad. Army Group Center would advance to Moscow, and Army Group South would occupy Ukraine. Hitler's generals remained silent when he presented the plan. They were concerned it was too ambitious and would spread their forces too thinly, but no one dared voice their doubts. The Red Army was much larger. It had nearly 2 million men within reach of the Western Front and millions more in reserve. The Russians also had over 20,000 tanks, far more than Germany's 6,000. They were older and less powerful, but still a formidable fighting force. The question for Germany was whether its superior technology and speed could crush the Russians before the vast numbers of the Red Army wore them down. Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941. The Luftwaffe joined the assault at dawn, targeting Soviet airfields. Simultaneously, the ground attack began. The Germans quickly crossed the Bug River on the border between Poland and the Soviet Union. Hitler's panzers soon began to penetrate deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, the panzers had pushed more than 50 miles forward. Poorly coordinated Red Army counterattacks were quickly beaten back. Tens of thousands of prisoners were captured. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had complete dominance in the air. The leadership of the Red Army seemed paralyzed by the German onslaught. On June 29th, 7 days after the attack began, 2 panzer thrusts met near Minsk, encircling large pockets of Soviet troops. As the follow-up infantry arrived, more than 300,000 prisoners were captured. Often, the Germans found themselves being welcomed as liberators, particularly in Ukraine, where anti-Russian sentiment was widespread. In Moscow, Stalin appeared to suffer a nervous breakdown upon hearing the news of Hitler's betrayal. He remained silent for more than a week. Only on July 3rd did he appeal to the patriotism of his people to save the homeland. In Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the news of Operation Barbarossa with very different feelings. It meant the country was no longer alone. He announced that any enemy of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain, no matter the political differences of the past. He then sent a mission to Moscow to sign a mutual assistance treaty with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. But aside from diplomatic support, there was little Britain could immediately do to help the Soviet Union. As June turned into July, the German blitzkrieg pushed further into Soviet territory. It began to seem as if nothing could stop Hitler, but he was about to make his first major strategic mistake. In early July 1941, more than 300,000 Red Army troops were encircled west of Minsk. Hitler's panzer commanders, particularly General Heinz Guderian, pleaded to be allowed to press on. Operation Barbarossa was working like clockwork. Within a week, the panzers were in Smolensk, deep inside Russia and only a few hundred miles from Moscow. On July 22nd, a pincer movement by the panzers met east of Smolensk, capturing another 300,000 Soviet troops. Here there was a brief pause while the rest of the army caught up to the front. Though the tanks could move at spectacular speed, most of the army still had to walk or rely on horse-drawn transport. But even so, it took only 5 days to arrive in the Red Area and begin clearing it. The operation was completed in another 9 days. Vast columns of Soviet prisoners began marching westward into captivity. More than 2.5 million would never return. Moscow was now only 200 miles away, and the path was open. It seemed certain that it would fall by the end of summer, as planned. But elsewhere, the German advance was encountering more difficulties. The Red Army was counterattacking more effectively, and by mid-July, Army Group South was still more than 50 miles from Kiev. Hitler decided that Guderian's panzers should postpone their advance on Moscow and move south to Kiev to provide support. Guderian strongly opposed this, but Hitler was inflexible. There should be no further advances on Moscow until Kiev had fallen. This would prove to be a fateful decision. There were already troubling signs that the Red Army would not be easily defeated, as Hitler had expected. The number of Soviet troops seemed endless. More than 16 million troops were now mobilized, and the Red Army now had some formidable new weapons, particularly a new tank, the T-34. It had a 76-millimeter cannon and was faster and better for rough terrain than the Panzer Mark V. Even so, as the blitzkrieg continued, it was easy to ignore the warning signs. Guderian's panzer group began its advance southward on August 23, 1941. The panzers of Army Group South advanced northward. 3 weeks later, the pincers met east of Kiev on September 16th. 2 more Soviet armies were completely destroyed. 500,000 men were killed or captured. On the same day, more than 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North surrounded the city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. The city was immediately cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union and besieged. Hitler decided not to attack it directly, and German troops prepared to starve it into surrender. As the German advance in northern Russia continued, the railway link to Leningrad was cut. The fate of Leningrad, and with it 30 Russian divisions, seemed sealed. The next phase of the battle was to be an assault on the city. Contrary to their own expectations, the men of the 18th German Army were not called upon to mount a large-scale attack on the city. and after a series of fierce battles in the surrounding areas, Hitler, uncharacteristically, ordered his troops to take Leningrad through a prolonged siege. It is suggested that he was shaken by the remotely detonated explosions the Russians had used so effectively in Kiev. This is a decision that still provokes debate. Today, there are really two possible explanations for Army Group North's failure to take Leningrad. One was the conflicting priorities in the mind of Adolf Hitler and the Army High Command. Hitler vacillated between prioritizing various objectives. There is also a school of thought that favors Hitler's adverse reaction to the heavy losses suffered by the 6th German Army in Kiev in August and September. In Kiev, thousands of German soldiers were lost due to remotely detonated explosions, and thousands more in desperate street fighting. This, it is believed, persuaded Hitler that no German soldier should be made vulnerable by being committed to the streets of Moscow and Leningrad. In any case, the 18th Army lacked the heavy artillery truly needed to reduce Leningrad's defenses. The massive guns of the German siege train had already been allocated to Army Group South's sector, where they were intended for the coming battles in Crimea. Moving them across Russia would have delayed the operation into winter. To compound the attackers' problems, Panzer Group 4 was withdrawn from Army Group North in late September 1941 to support Army Group Center in Operation Typhoon, the final push on Moscow. No German army group could afford to lose its tanks, but Army Group North lost virtually all its armor. The withdrawal of tanks from Army Group North meant the army became virtually immobile, and it would remain so for almost 3 years. It is easy to suggest that the loss of Panzer Group 4 in September 1941 was directly responsible for Army Group North's failure to reach its strategic goal of capturing Leningrad. Capturing such a large and well-defended city as Leningrad was far from guaranteed, even with a strong armored force. However, the removal of Panzer Group 4 clearly did not help Army Group North's cause. Army Group North was deprived of this unique formation, which compromised its size, speed, and combat power. As a result, they were unable to quickly advance beyond Leningrad, join with the Finns, and effectively cut the city's supply lines. The disappearance of Panzer Group 4 proved to be a harbinger of things to come. From that point onward, it became clear that, of the 3 German army groups, Army Group North was regarded as the poor relation. It soon became evident that they could not expect to receive any substantial additional support of any kind, and the artillery siege train would never be sent to Leningrad. The 18th Army, therefore, had no alternative but to take Leningrad by siege. It seemed that the decisive battles on the Eastern Front would be fought elsewhere. Army Group North would remain stubbornly committed to the northern flank of the German armies, fighting on the Eastern Front throughout the entire duration of the war. The siege of Leningrad was the scene of intense fighting, which years later would be recognized as a crucial event in that conflict of inhuman savagery. The early phases were bitterly contested in the city's suburbs. When General Zhukov arrived to take command of the city's defense on September 10, 1941, he found the defenders in an advanced state of disorganization and the population near panic. Undaunted, he quickly began reinforcing his defenses. The shortage of anti-tank guns was resolved by converting anti-aircraft artillery for the task of trying to stop the panzers. Zhukov began taking the fight to the Germans through raids and counterattacks. But by then, German troops had already penetrated the inner ring of defenses and were ravaging the suburbs. After a furious exchange of advances and withdrawals, by the end of the month, the defenders were clinging to the city with all their strength. It seemed inevitable that Leningrad would capitulate, but while Zhukov awaited a new assault, Panzer Group 4 suddenly departed to join the battle for Moscow, and the remaining German forces began building fortifications. Hitler decreed that Leningrad would not be taken by force, but would instead be subdued by starvation. However, there was a flaw in the plan. Although the supply situation was difficult, without Panzer Group 4, the siege around the city was never completely closed. It was still possible to reach the city by land through the virgin forests of Mother Russia. It was also possible to bring supplies by boat across the waters of Lake Ladoga. In October, there was some temporary relief for the defenders during the mud season. The roads disintegrated into bottomless channels of mud, where wheeled vehicles could only move at a snail's pace and only if towed by tanks. This was the Rasputitsa, the mud season, which came as a crippling surprise to the Germans in 1941. German losses of tanks and motorized equipment of all kinds were extraordinarily high during the autumn mud period of 1941, the first time Russian mud had been encountered. One division of Panzer Group 4 operating in the area north of Gachina during the same period lost 50 tanks without a single shot being fired, 35 of them in just 3 days. These losses were extremely serious, as no replacements were received. The Germans had no concept of mud as it exists in European Russia. In the autumn of 1941, when frontline troops were already stuck in the mud, the German High Command still believed that the mud could be conquered by brute force, an idea that led to severe losses of vehicles and equipment. At the height of the mud season, tractors and recovery vehicles, normally capable of crossing difficult terrain, were powerless, and attempts to plow through the mass of mud only made the roads even more impassable. Tanks, heavy recovery vehicles, and even vehicles with good ground clearance simply pushed an ever-growing wall of mud in front of them until they finally stopped, half buried by their own movement. A sudden frost in autumn 1941 cemented one buried and crippled column into a state of complete uselessness, and it never moved again, as it could not be reached in any other way. Gasoline, tow ropes, and food supplies were dropped by plane along the line of stuck armored vehicles, but all attempts to move were futile. Often, when drivers found themselves bogged down far from any habitation, they abandoned their vehicles and set off on foot to contact friendly troops in the nearest village, or sought food and shelter with local civilians to stay alive until the worst of the mud season passed. For the mud seasons, vehicles with high ground clearance, lightweight, and low ground pressure were needed. German trucks had low ground clearance and couldn't get traction in deep mud. As the German supply trucks had wheels too narrow for muddy terrain, they sank deep into the soft ground. Conditions in the city became grim. The only link to the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga to the east, but only a small amount of food could be brought by water. Starvation set in. More than 11,000 people died in November. Only in December was it possible to open a route across the lake, and there was a slight increase in rations, but 3,700 people died of hunger on a single day in December. Inside Leningrad, food supplies for the besieged city dwindled throughout the autumn. By the end of November, they were at their lowest point for the entire duration of the siege. Manual laborers were receiving only 250 grams of bread per day, 1/3 of their normal requirement. Without water for sanitation and basic medical supplies, disease became inevitable. With the arrival of winter and temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Celsius, thousands began dying each day. Total starvation loomed constantly, and to the Germans, collapse seemed imminent. Back in Berlin, a reception with Adolf Hitler as the guest of honor was organized to celebrate the fall of the shattered city. Invitations were printed but never sent. Russian resistance remained stubborn and defiant. Even female soldiers in the Red Army served in combat units. The ferocity and inhumanity of the conflict defy imagination. In an attempt to alleviate the terrible conditions in the city, the Russians marked out a road across the frozen southwestern corner of Lake Ladoga, and by November 22nd, supply truck convoys were just barely managing to stave off starvation in the city. It was a dangerous passage through cutting northeastern winds that swept across the lake. The German Luftwaffe also did its best to intercept the convoys and break the ice surface. However, despite all its horror, the Russians knew that defending this vital lifeline to the city was the only possible way to keep the inhabitants alive. But for some, the food arriving across the ice was too little, too late. Victims of starvation, suffering from dropping blood pressure and deterioration of the heart and internal organs, would never regain their health. Many would die months after food and medical supplies finally arrived. Children who survived would emerge completely traumatized by the siege. As one eyewitness recalled, this was reflected in the way many of the children played alone, in the way that even in their group games, they played silently with heavily ghost-like faces. As events unfolded, it soon became clear that despite all the hardships of the Leningrad siege, the northern sector was considered by both sides as of secondary importance. The men of Army Group North soon became convinced they were fighting what they called the eternal war of the poor man. The casualties along the entire Russian front were enormous, but only 67,000 replacements were allocated to Army Group North, compared to 131,000 for Army Group Center and 119,000 for the Army groups in the south. When it came to allocating new divisions from reserves, the situation was even less favorable. Of the 21 new divisions released by the Army High Command in the autumn of 1941, only 3 were allocated to Army Group North. This was indicative of how things would play out. An unexpected benefit for the Army Group was the occasional support they received from German naval units operating in the Baltic. Since one flank was supported by the Baltic Sea, Army Group North was the only formation that could count on substantial support from the seas. The Soviet Navy in the Baltic was limited to providing fire support to the Soviet forces fighting to defend the city. This aspect of the fighting also provided the setting for a daring attack, led by Ulik Rudel, who was ordered to sink the Soviet battleship Marat. Rudel achieved this impressive feat amidst heavy anti-aircraft fire with a single well-placed bomb. On the other hand, the 18th Army had to engage in a series of amphibious operations to capture the Baltic Islands, which placed great strain on already severely limited resources. Throughout the entire war, the lack of powerful reinforcements severely limited the strategic options available to Army Group Command. It also required great effort to maintain the extended front line and the siege of Leningrad, which dragged on for nearly 3 years. The Germans came very close to the city and entered the outer suburbs, but the siege was never fully closed. One important consideration at that time was the role of the Finns. They agreed to approach Leningrad, with General Mannerheim making it clear that he was prepared to act to reclaim Finnish territory, ceded to Russia in the Winter War of 1939, but that he would not participate in a direct attack on Leningrad. This was one of the conditions Finland set when entering the war against Russia alongside the Germans. Mannerheim was as attentive to political conditions as to military ones, due to Finland's vulnerability to future Russian aggression. This meant that the German and Finnish armies were never able to completely cut off Leningrad from the rest of the world. Both in winter and in summer, Russian forces still managed to bring in supplies via Lake Ladoga, northeast of the city. Starting in the winter of 1942, the railway east of Leningrad was completed, connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union, which allowed forces to supply the city's inhabitants with what they needed to survive the siege. Soviet negotiators in the Soviet-Finnish peace talks, held in 1944, actually acknowledged what the Finns had done for them. If the Finns had advanced and closed the siege around Leningrad, it would have meant the death of the city. Despite some supplies making it through, it was far too little. Starvation drove the population to extreme measures, including the terrifying excess of cannibalism. The first cases occurred in early December 1941. The Soviet Penal Code did not mention such a crime as cannibalism, so initially, Soviet authorities could only define it as an extreme form of banditry. According to a top-secret report from the Leningrad military prosecutor, Ketov, dated February 27, 1942, investigations into cannibalism led to criminal charges against 26 individuals in December 1941, 366 in January, 1,942 and 494 in the first 2 weeks of February 1942. The investigation revealed that not only was human flesh consumed by individuals, but it was also sold to other citizens. On February 20, 1942, 866 individuals were under criminal investigation or had been formally charged on suspicion of cannibalism. Only 18% of that number had criminal records. Of the 866 suspects, 322 were men and 544 were women. Nearly 30% were over 40 years old, with the next largest group being those in their 30s. Even more morbid was the discovery of extensive grave robbing and mutilation of the recently deceased. One night, in March 1942, the guard at the Bogoslavsky Cemetery detained a woman with a bag. When the bag was opened, it revealed the bodies of 5 babies. The rise in cannibalism forced city authorities to place police guards at all major cemeteries. With the first snows of 1941 came a cruelly harsh winter. The temperature continued to fall, and German soldiers now paid dearly for the arrogance of the High Command, which had refused to admit the possibility of anything other than a quick and decisive campaign. Few men in the German trenches had more than summer clothing, and frostbite gangrene took a devastating toll. German machines and weapons had never been designed to function under such extremes. Engines seized up, tank treads broke in the cold, ammunition failed to fire. The cold was far beyond the experience of most Germans. Encouraged by the problems they saw in German ranks, a series of Soviet counterattacks managed to reverse many of the German gains around Leningrad. With incredible effort, the Germans maintained a semblance of defense. Winter warfare tactics centered on battles over control of roads and inhabited places. In Russia, villages and roads were far more important than elsewhere on the continent. In other German theaters of war, no single road became a crucial factor, since a well-developed road network always offered alternative routes. In Russia, the possession of a single road often meant life or death for an entire army. The extreme tactical importance of inhabited places during the 6 winter months explains the fact that the Russians often preferred to destroy them rather than surrender them to the enemy. In the bitter trench warfare outside Leningrad, the defender had a definite advantage in the winter, because, in general, their positions could not be seen in the snow except at close range. Defenders could keep their forces under cover and wait until their fire could be used most effectively. Attackers were also hindered and easily detected, even with camouflage clothing. The defender's main weapon became the machine gun, as its performance was not diminished by snow, in which mortars and light artillery lost much of their effectiveness. Replacements were also becoming a problem for German forces. After the war, it became clear from the diaries of Army Group North that the commanders of both formations had intentionally prohibited, even during calm periods, the withdrawal of a unit from the front line to grant it a rest period. It was better to keep the divisions on the front line and assign them to a narrower sector, because otherwise any reserve unit removed from the northern front would certainly be taken by high command and sent to more urgent pressure points, whether on the central or southern front. Although the northern front was considered of secondary importance, in no sense was it an area of little activity. There was still much terrible fighting in very difficult terrain, with extensive swamps and few roads through vast sections of impenetrable forest, which presented a logistical nightmare. Army Group North and its divisions faced the most difficult conditions on the Eastern Front. The weather and terrain were completely different around Leningrad. It was very swampy and flooded, and there were very few roads, so all transport logistics were extremely difficult. To compound the Germans' difficulties, in October 1941, the first partisan attacks began to cause serious problems in rear areas. The effects of these attacks were further aggravated by the fact that Russia's underdeveloped infrastructure meant there were very few roads or railways that could be used as alternatives to those blocked by partisan activity. The Russian winter was a nightmare along the entire front, but it was Army Group North that bore the brunt of the most extreme Russian winters. The cruel realities of fighting in the fierce northern Russian winters cannot be overstated. In addition to the geographic and climatic difficulties, the fighting spirit of the Red Army facing Army Group North was no less intense than that shown in other sectors. The siege of Leningrad became synonymous with resistance and suffering, but there was also a great deal of intense combat as a series of smaller battles advanced and retreated along the siege lines outside Leningrad. Despite coming very close to victory on several occasions, Army Group North never managed to completely close the siege around Leningrad, and High Command continued to withdraw desperately needed divisions from Army Group North's sector to support other sectors under pressure. The result of this deterioration on two fronts was that a fierce Soviet offensive in January 1944 finally broke Army Group North's resistance and lifted the siege. The lifting of the siege of Leningrad in 1944 forced Army Group North to retreat to a new defensive line composed of a series of partially built fortifications known as the Panther Line. This line was supposed to represent a fallback position for German forces, but construction began far too late. Now that we understand the full spectrum of Leningrad, let us return to September 1941. Meanwhile, Army Group Center was now preparing for the final attack on Moscow. Guderian's panzers had regrouped to lead the assault. The Germans had a 2-to-1 superiority in tanks and men on the front, and a 3-to-1 advantage in aircraft. The attack began on September 20th, 1941. Once again, Guderian's panzers pushed deep into the Red Army. By October 7th, even more Soviet troops had been encircled, but Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the end. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the city's defense. The people of Moscow were mobilized to dig a series of defensive lines, but the real obstacle to the German advance would be the weather. On October 8th, heavy rains began, and German vehicles soon became bogged down in a sea of mud. By the end of October, the terrible weather and increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance meant that Army Group Center was still about 50 miles from Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his earlier decision that year to delay the advance on Moscow. At the same time, Army Group South reached the Black Sea, trapping even more Soviet soldiers. Another 100,000 prisoners were captured, but they too were hampered by the weather. Even so, the city of Kiev was captured on October 24th, 1941. But the weather was beginning to freeze. The German forces, confident that the campaign would be concluded by summer, were caught by surprise. Without winter clothing, they suffered terribly on the Moscow front. Army Group Center was now beginning its final push to capture the Soviet capital. By December 4th, its main units were just 19 miles from Moscow, where some reconnaissance patrols claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin shining in the distance. But that night, the temperature dropped again. Tank engines couldn't start, weapons froze, and many soldiers suffered severe frostbite. On December 5th, the Germans halted the attack. Winter had come to the Red Army's rescue, but the Germans were confident that in the spring they could finish the job. During much of the autumn of 1941, Stalin's armies had resisted the German assault. But at the same time, he had another concern: that the Japanese would attack his forces in Siberia. But in November, the Soviet dictator received a message from his top spy in Japan, assuring him that the Japanese had no such intentions. Immediately, more than 30 divisions began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway toward Moscow. They were well equipped and well trained for winter fighting. By early December, more than 500,000 extra men were positioned near the capital. On December 5th, just as the Germans were abandoning their attempt to capture Moscow, they were struck by a savage Russian attack. First came a massive Soviet artillery bombardment. Then swarms of Soviet T-34 tanks broke through the German defenses. Stunned by the ferocity of an attack from an enemy they had assumed was on the brink of defeat, the Germans retreated. Over the next 7 days, Soviet troops devastated the German forces. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to halt the Moscow offensive, it was a terrible blow. On December 19th, he dismissed his overall commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and took personal command himself. Guderian was also dismissed, along with 35 other senior officers. Hitler now ordered that there be no further retreats. German troops were to fight and, if necessary, die where they stood. It worked. The German line gradually stabilized. But Stalin, emboldened by the Red Army's success, now demanded a massive advance across the entire front. Marshal Zhukov, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, tried to dissuade him, but Stalin was determined. Over the next 4 months, fighting swirled inconclusively around the German defensive positions. For Hitler, this was a deeply uncomfortable situation. He was used to and expected quick results. Now he was dangerously bogged down in the Soviet Union and facing an enemy that never seemed to give up. Russia wasn't his only headache. On December 7, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States without warning. Hitler, almost without thinking, also declared war on the US. With no prior planning, he had taken on a massive new enemy. As 1941 became 1942, Hitler remained determined to resume the offensive in Russia, but he needed a new strategy. The original plan to fight along the entire front was no longer viable. In addition, as his economic advisors told him, Germany's oil supplies were running out. So he decided to halt the attack in the north and instead drive toward the oil fields of southern Russia. The initial plan for Operation Blue, as it was called, envisioned an attack south of Kiev, with Army Group A advancing to capture the oil fields, while Army Group B covered its flank along the Don River. From the beginning, there was brutal fighting with Soviet forces trying to retake Kiev. Another 200,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, and 70,000 were killed. As part of the same operation, the Germans tightened the siege on the port of Sevastopol in Crimea. For 8 months, the defenders were under constant bombardment from German artillery, including a massive 400mm railway gun. By the end of June 1942, Sevastopol finally fell to the Germans. It was now safe to go for the oil fields. On June 28th, the offensive began. Army Group B forced its way to the Don River and advanced along its western path. Army Group A faced stronger resistance, but by July 9th was near Rostov. Hitler now made a series of grave strategic mistakes. While Army Group B advanced along the Don, Hitler ordered it to capture Stalingrad, although the city had no immediate strategic importance. The army was suddenly tasked with a massive new objective. 2 weeks later, Hitler compounded his error in judgment. Frustrated with the slow progress of the campaign in the Caucasus, he diverted most of his panzers to the mountains. The march on Stalingrad visibly slowed. The reinforced Army Group A now raced across the Caucasus to within 70 miles of the Caspian Sea, threatening to cut off all Soviet armies in the area. But then Hitler changed his mind again and, enraged by the slow progress of Army Group B in Stalingrad, now ordered the panzers back north. On August 9th, Army Group A captured the first of the southern oil fields in M. They found them completely destroyed. But without reinforcements, they couldn't advance further, and the vast oil fields in the central Caucasus and those near the Caspian Sea remained out of reach. The German supply lines were so stretched that, in a grim harbinger of things to come, some Germans resorted to eating their horses. Furthermore, a full quarter of Paulus's casualties so far had been due to typhus and dysentery, which gripped both German and Soviet forces. Speaking of the Soviets, Stalin had anticipated Hitler's shift in strategy and was making preparations. Factories produced a surge of tanks, and reserves were brought in to reinforce Stalingrad. On July 27th, Stalin issued the infamous Order 227, commanding all Soviet soldiers not to retreat and imposing harsh penalties on officers who withdrew without approval. The order was issued in direct response to an idea sweeping the demoralized Red Army that the Soviets should outwit the Nazis by retreating deeper and deeper into the vast Soviet territory until the most advantageous moment to fight presented itself. In his order, Stalin countered this narrative with one of his own. Russian civilians forced to live under the German yoke were cursing the Red Army for abandoning them in their hour of desperate need. Russian workers called upon their soldiers to fight back in Stalingrad. These same civilians were recruited to dig trenches or work emergency shifts in weapons factories. After nearly a month of preparations on both sides, the Germans and their allies crossed the Don River on August 21st, setting the stage for one of the bloodiest battles in history. The Luftwaffe opened the assault on Stalingrad with a multi-day bombing campaign, reaching its peak on August 23rd. 600 bombers from Luftflotte leveled large parts of the city, killing between 40,000 and 75,000 people. German spearheads approached the city shortly after, encountering fanatical resistance before pushing up to the Volga on the northern side, where they were promptly cut off by the communists. A pocket formed around that spearhead, and the troops under General Gustav Anton von Wittersheim were surrounded. 2 days later, General Hermann Hoth led the 4th Panzer Army in an attack on the city's southern flank, only to be repelled by the Russians. A second armored spearhead managed to break into the northern pocket and deliver critical supplies, but the potential rescuers abandoned the pocket when they realized they had not brought enough infantry to hold their position. The Soviets in the south slowly lost men to the northern front line, with the last remaining division in the sector belonging to the NKVD, the secret police, which was soon transferred to the northern sector as well, and the withdrawal gave Hoth an opening. As the civilian population panicked, he pushed northward, covering 20 kilometers. Soviet commander Yeremenko withdrew his men to better defensive positions within the city as the Germans advanced. August ended with Paulus's 6th Army breaking the siege in the north and relieving their comrades after a week of entrenched combat. The German lines solidified, and with the start of September, the Nazis had partially surrounded Stalin's city. Georgy Zhukov, future hero of the Soviet Union, launched an attack to the north intended to break the German line and once again encircle the fascists. But the Germans managed to hold firm. Zhukov may not have surrounded his enemies, but he captured their attention and immobilized several of Paulus's men. Hitler, seeing yet another opportunity to complicate things, dismissed the commander of Army Group B and took personal command of northern operations. With the Führer as leader, the Germans continued to make the same slow but steady progress in Stalingrad, with the Fourth Army gaining ground in the south. The 29th Motorized Division, in particular, became the first German unit to reach the southern banks of the Volga on September 9th. With the 29th in place, Soviet defenders were split into their constituent groups. The 62nd and 64th Armies found themselves isolated from each other, with the 62nd relying on supplies ferried across the Volga, supplies that had to cross intense German fire. The 62nd Army was terribly weakened, with its only full division being the NKVD riflemen who had been pulled back in the face of Hoth's advance the previous month. Despite its shortcomings, the 62nd fought with determination, resisting the Germans as they pushed into the suburbs. But now Hitler's attention had shifted once again. By the end of August, German forces were within striking distance of Stalingrad. The assault on the city, which bore the name of Hitler's arch-enemy, had begun. It would become one of the most crucial battles of World War II. On August 17, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus and the Sixth Army crossed the Don River and launched a final attack on Stalingrad. 6 days later, a panzer advance had reached the Volga River north of the city, and German forces were fighting on the outskirts of the city. Hitler seemed on the verge of a famous victory. Stalingrad was a major industrial center. It stretched for more than 12 miles along the western bank of the river. Its factories produced over a quarter of the Soviet Union's tractors and trucks, as well as tanks and weapons. The Russian people had turned it into a formidable fortress. They were helped by Hitler's decision to send Army Group B's panzers south, which gave them 2 extra weeks to prepare. The German plan was to launch a direct assault on the city. Thus began one of the longest and most intense battles of World War II. Slowly, the Germans advanced street by street, with Stuka bombings clearing the way ahead. The fighting was savage, house by house, room by room. Soviet defenders used the sewers for shelter and communications, and the ruins above to fire from. Russian reinforcements had to be ferried across the river, often under aerial attack. Even so, thousands managed to make it through. Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, ordered his frontline troops to stay close to the German lines, maintaining constant contact to prevent the Luftwaffe from providing air support, fearing they might bomb their own Aryan comrades. The hand-to-hand combat led to intense urban warfare, as Soviets fought the Axis room to room, house to house, opening a new and brutal phase of the battle. The Germans reached Stalingrad proper on September 13th. The Luftwaffe once again rained bombs on the city, composing a symphony of destruction with heavy German artillery. The Soviets responded in kind, counterattacking with their own cannons and Katyusha rockets. Elements of the Sixth Army pushed deep into the city and forced the Soviets into a near encirclement. Despite fierce resistance, the Germans captured key hills overlooking the city center, and in the following 2 days, advanced through the heart of Stalingrad, capturing railway stations and pressing strongly toward the Volga. With the Fourth Army providing support from the south, the Sixth Army reached the Volga in just 1 day, placing the Germans well within Stalingrad. But it wasn't all flowers and sauerkraut for the Germans. The Soviets recaptured the heights overlooking the city center on September 16th. General von Wittersheim, who had nobly commanded the surrounded Germans at the onset of the attack, was dismissed when he suggested that the Germans ultimately would not be able to take Stalingrad, and proposed a withdrawal from positions on the Volga. And, to make matters worse, a group of 50 Soviet soldiers fortified a grain silo, famously defending it from the Germans as the German offensive began to slow down. The exhausted Soviets in the grain silo held out for another 4 days, until the Germans finally cleared them out on September 21st. These wouldn't be the last pockets of Soviet resistance. Around the same time, a group of Soviet soldiers took and fortified an apartment block that would come to be known as Pavlov's house. Pavlov held out until November, a siege within a siege that lasted 60 days. By the end of September, the Germans controlled approximately 2/3 of Stalingrad and were preparing for a final push into the city's industrial heart. The already warned Soviets were reinforced by the 1047th Rifle Regiment, which crossed the Volga on September 22nd. They wouldn't be the only reinforcements the Soviets could count on, however. The temperature in Stalingrad began to drop. Icy winds, a message from the Russians' old ally, General Winter. These chilling winds provided a fitting prelude to a storm that was forming in the Russian countryside. For almost the entire month of September, in absolute secrecy, Joseph Stalin, Georgy Zhukov, and the Stavka had been formulating plans for a counteroffensive and were nearly ready to act. As Soviet reinforcements continued to arrive in Stalingrad, Paulus launched an assault on the industrial sector. By the end of September, the Germans had advanced through most of the city, nearly reaching the Volga. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad had now become an obsession. The reinforced Soviets pushed the Nazis back, and on October 4th, Paulus learned that the 51st Corps, at the tip of the German spearhead, had suffered so many casualties it had lost all offensive capability. The Germans suspended offensive operations for a full 10 days to rest and resupply, except for one attack on October 13th by Hoth, which saw the Fourth Army finally reach the Volga. The rest of October would be a hard fight for both Germans and Soviets, as the Germans renewed their assault on the industrial district and began to advance. The Germans paid dearly for every minute of progress, and the Luftwaffe bombing raids that had opened the battle bore bitter fruit. Göring's aces left a trail of destruction in their wake that inadvertently tipped the battle slightly in favor of the Soviet defenders. The Communists fortified or hid in emptied buildings and labyrinths of rubble, transforming the corpse of the city into an almost continuous line of defenses and traps that forced the Germans to advance methodically and fight hand to hand. The German advance through the industrial zone continued through November, while the Soviets resisted every step. On the 11th, the Soviets were pushed into isolated pockets of resistance in factories and homes, pockets that the Germans attacked repeatedly, with assaults the Soviets repeatedly repelled before eventually failing. The Germans, low on men, material, and willpower, began to stumble. A week later, the Soviets controlled only a stretch of the Volga riverbank, no more than 10% of the city. The Russians were cornered, but the Germans were too worn out and undersupplied to continue the attack. Paulus could count over 60,000 casualties in the 6th Army alone. On October 4th, 1942, General Paulus launched what was supposed to be the final attack on Stalingrad. Tanks led the way, advancing over rubble and firing at close range into courtyards. A German officer said the advance was measured in corpses, not meters. German victory seemed certain, but in reality the Germans were dangerously overextended. By mid-November, the Soviet army was bringing in reinforcements. More than 1 million troops, 132,000 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft were secretly moved to the battle zone. On November 19th, they attacked the northern flank of the Germans. After a massive artillery barrage, T-34s and assault infantry broke through German positions. Now it was the Germans surrendering en masse. The next day, a Soviet attack in the south was equally successful, and by November 23rd, these movements met west of Stalingrad, encircling the German 6th Army. General Paulus, responsible for the German forces, could have broken the encirclement, but Hitler ordered him to stay and fight. Hitler had been assured by the Luftwaffe that enough supplies could be flown into Stalingrad. That was enough for him to announce that German positions should hold until relieved. On December 12th, Von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, an attempt to break through to Paulus and relieve the Germans trapped in Stalingrad. Paulus requested permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout, and once again was denied. The Sixth Army could only wait for freedom or destruction. There were no other options. Von Manstein advanced towards Stalingrad and, after a week, was bogged down by the Soviets just 48 kilometers from the city. New offensives slowed von Manstein even further, and the obedient Paulus continued to follow his Führer's orders to remain in place. As Christmas arrived in Stalingrad, General Winter delivered a special gift to the Nazis. On Christmas Day, 1,300 men froze to death, gangrenous in mass. The Soviets brought their own gifts, launching an endless wave of attacks and probes. As they froze to death or were shot by Soviets, one could imagine the German soldiers wishing that St. Nicholas would at least bring them some coal. They could burn it to stay warm. The new year would bring only new miseries for the Germans. Bands of soldiers wandered through the ruined streets, searching for food and warmth. Thousands of wounded agonized without treatment due to a lack of supplies. The Soviets offered the Germans generous surrender terms, giving Paulus the chance to save his men and himself from certain death at the hands of General Zhukov or General Winter. The proud Prussian refused, and on January 6th, the Soviets launched a new wave of attacks that split the Sixth Army into two parts. As his men were forced to take shelter in two separate pockets, Paulus's supply situation worsened. Soviet attacks forced his troops to abandon critical airfields, and even if they could be held, the Luftwaffe began to reduce supply drops, lowering the tonnage as the siege dragged on. On the 22nd, the Soviets again demanded surrender, and Paulus sent a message to Hitler saying that his men had no ammunition or food, and that his ability to command them was deteriorating by the moment. 2 days later, he reported having 18,000 untreated wounded and begged Hitler for permission to surrender his men to the Soviets. Hitler orders Paulus to hold his position to the last man, the last cartridge. The next day, the Soviets capture the last remaining airfield the Germans could use to receive airdrops. Whatever Paulus has in his stockpiles is all he will ever have. Across the encircled 6th and 4th Armies, 100,000 men die in January alone, and the two armies are split into northern and southern pockets with no means of communication. As Paulus struggles with Hitler's order not to surrender, he receives a most unwelcome surprise, a promotion from Hitler to Field Marshal. But instead of an honor, it was a death sentence, as no field marshal had ever surrendered or been captured alive before. With the stroke of his pen, Hitler orders Paulus to place himself on the altar of National Socialism and die. On January 31st, Paulus becomes the first German field marshal to be captured. According to him, Paulus and his headquarters staff, who were based in the basement of a department store, were suddenly overrun by Soviet forces and had no choice but to surrender. Paulus would insist to the last man that he never formally surrendered to the Russians and refused their orders to command his men to surrender. The southern pocket collapses under the weight of Paulus's capture, but the north barely holds. The next day, General Karl Strecker, the de facto commander of the northern pocket, gathers his staff to inform them of the South's collapse. He issues a general order authorizing all troops under his command to act according to the dictates of their conscience, a flowery way of saying, "Surrender if you want to live," without actually using the words. And that is exactly what Strecker does on February 2nd. The Sixth Army formally surrenders to Georgy Zhukov, but 11,000 Germans refuse to give up the fight, hiding in the ruins of Stalingrad. There is no fanatical resistance or desperate attempt at victory. These were Germans afraid of Soviet reprisals, with no central command and no mission other than survival. These holdouts hid in ruins and sewers during the day and scavenged at night. Their lives were desperate and violent, caught in firefights with Soviet forces and fighting for mere existence. It would take until March 1943 for the Soviets to eliminate these renegade Germans and fully secure Stalingrad. The civilian population of Stalingrad fared little better than the men in uniform. Although there were sporadic evacuations of civilians throughout the battle, organized by either the Germans, the Soviets, or as a response to panic from the changing tides of battle, the loss of life was still enormous. 170,000 civilians died in the Battle of Stalingrad, and that number includes those who died after the war, after being enslaved by the Germans and marched to forced labor camps in Ukraine and elsewhere. While Soviet POWs in German custody were nearly annihilated, the Germans would fare no better. 95% of the men captured by the Soviets at the end of the battle would never return home. Stalingrad was a massacre, a machine of destruction fueled by human life and misery. But it was also a testament to the fighting spirit of those on the ground. It was Germany's greatest catastrophe in the war so far. But it would not be the last. The Red Army was now inflicting massive defeats on Hitler's forces across the entire Eastern Front. Stalingrad had been a major triumph for the Soviet Army. Now, its operational commander, Marshal Zhukov, set his sights on Germany's Army Group A, still camped in the Caucasus. Soviet troops advanced from Stalingrad, and by early December 1942, they were just 200 kilometers from Rostov. There was a real possibility that all German forces in the south could be cut off. With few options left, Hitler reluctantly gave Army Group A permission to retreat. In the following month, the Germans fought a skillful rearguard action. Hundreds of thousands of troops pulled back. Then, on January 12, 1943, Zhukov launched an all-out attack. The Soviets attacked along a 700-kilometer front, outnumbering the German forces 7-1. Manstein, the overall commander of German forces in the region, conducted a brilliant mobile withdrawal. This Russian winter offensive had dealt a devastating blow to German power. In just a few months, Germany had lost 1 million men and a large number of tanks and weapons. The Red Army still had huge reserves of manpower. It was also benefiting from a massive increase in weapons production and aid from the United States and Britain. The Germans also no longer had the technological edge. The T-34 tank was more than a match for the Panzer IV. They also had the terrifying Katyusha multi-rocket system, which devastated German troops. Still, Hitler refused to lose hope. He still dreamed of a summer preemptive strike that would destabilize the Soviet Union and regain the initiative. He also had an ace up his sleeve. The German counterattack would be led by a new generation of German tanks, specially designed to counter the formidable Russian T-34. The massive but slow 55-ton Tiger had a lethal 88mm gun, and its frontal armor made it nearly immune to Soviet tank guns. There was also the 43-ton Panther, faster, with a new 75mm gun also capable of destroying the T-34. These tanks were so new that Hitler was forced to delay the attack until enough were manufactured and delivered to the front. But even as German forces began to mass, Soviet commander Marshal Zhukov guessed what was about to happen. Shortly after, he received intelligence from a Soviet spy inside the German High Command, confirming the location of the attack. Zhukov ordered the construction of a series of defensive lines with anti-tank trenches, minefields, and deep belts of barbed wire. He also massively increased Soviet forces in the area, bringing in troops and tanks from less vulnerable parts of the front. On the eve of the attack on Kursk, the Germans were immensely outnumbered by the Soviet defenders, who also knew exactly when the Germans would attack. On July 5, 1943, just as German troops prepared for the attack, they were struck by an immense Soviet artillery bombardment. Even so, the next morning, the panzers still advanced. But this time, they faced a well-entrenched enemy. There was no real chance of a rapid breakthrough. The results were disastrous. In the north, the German army advanced only 6 miles, losing 25,000 men and over 200 tanks. In the south, the Germans performed slightly better. A 25-mile advance was made into Soviet defenses, but also at high cost. 10,000 men were killed and 350 tanks destroyed. For a brief moment, it seemed a German breakthrough might be possible. Then Zhukov launched his reserves. On July 12, 1943, 900 tanks surged toward the German front line. Nearly 2,000 tanks were now engaged in the largest armored battle of the Second World War. Soviet T-34s surged through German lines and opened fire at close range. After a single day of brutal combat, the Germans had lost another 350 tanks and were retreating. Meanwhile, in the sky, there was an epic aerial battle. Eventually, the Soviet Air Force gained supremacy over the Luftwaffe. The Russians could now use their formidable Il-2 Sturmovik to decimate enemy tanks. By July 23rd, the Germans had lost all the ground they had gained, and with it, the best of their army. Hitler's gamble at Kursk had cost him at least 50,000 troops and over 700 tanks. Never again would the Germans launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Russians had changed the course of the war. Summer of 1944. 1 year after its great defeat at Kursk, the German armed forces were suffering from a shortage of men, tanks, and aircraft. Now Hitler faced a war on 2 fronts. While troops moved westward to face the D-Day landings, the Red Army prepared a powerful offensive in the east. In the middle of the night, under heavy guard, a new tank regiment arrived at a train station near the border with Belarus. Alongside the T-34s, some very heavy and bulky objects, covered by tarps, were unloaded from the freight cars. The Red Army's plans in Belarus were top secret. These objects would remain a mystery for several days, until they were revealed at the training ground. They were heavy metal rollers, which would be attached to the front of a T-34. They transformed the tank into a mine clearer. The rollers would detonate any mines in the tank's path, opening a safe passage for infantry and other vehicles to follow. 2 regiments of these engineering tanks were secretly deployed to the First Belarusian Front. Clearly, the front commander, General Rokossovsky, was planning some kind of offensive. But to any observer, the Soviet forces in Belarus appeared to be merely making defensive preparations. From the air, only movements away from the front lines could be detected. Everything was done to give the impression that this sector was being weakened and that a Soviet offensive was being prepared elsewhere. On June 6, 1944, the day of the Allied landings in Normandy, Stalin wrote to Churchill, "The summer offensive of the Soviet forces, as agreed at the Tehran Conference, will begin in mid-June in one of the vital sectors of the front." Which vital sector was not even shared with the Allied heads of government. In the east, the Germans were firmly on the defensive in June 1944, while struggling to repel the D-Day landings in France. The Army Group North was retreating from Leningrad. The Army Group South had given up Crimea and much of Ukraine. Only Army Group Center appeared to be holding firm. German positions on this front formed the so-called Belarusian salient. Here, Army Group Center stood firm. During the winter, it had successfully repelled 2 Soviet offensives. Hitler and the German High Command had much to consider as summer approached. They had no concrete information on when or where the main Soviet offensive would be launched. The Germans decided that Stalin would seek to capitalize on his recent gains in Ukraine. they had brought the Red Army within striking distance of Romania and its oil fields. Thus, in the summer of 1944, precious German reserves of tanks and aircraft were sent south. When the Soviet High Command Stavka saw German reinforcements moving to Ukraine, this confirmed their decision to launch a surprise attack in Belarus. Here, the Red Army would have the chance to avenge its worst defeat, suffered at the hands of the Germans in the early months of the war. The operation was codenamed Bagration. Stavka planned a series of assaults against the flanks of Army Group Center, which would be encircled and destroyed near the cities of Vitebsk and Bobruisk. Then the Red Army would advance on Minsk, cutting off the German retreat. The Soviets planned nothing less than the total destruction of the German Army Group Center. The Red Army had never before set such a massive and ambitious objective for itself. General Rokossovsky proposed that his first Belarusian front carry out 2 simultaneous attacks against the German right flank, at Bobruisk and Slutsk. Each attack would receive equal priority. This contradicted standard Soviet military doctrine, which dictated that there should be a single main axis of advance, with all other attacks acting as support. Konstantin Rokossovsky was a decorated hero of World War I and the Russian Civil War. But probably because of his Polish origin, he found himself caught in Stalin's Great Purge in 1937. Despite being tortured by the NKVD secret police, he refused to sign a confession or betray his colleagues. He was released in 1940 and reinstated to his post. At the start of the war, he commanded a mechanized corps but quickly rose to higher command. In May 1944, Rokossovsky was called to a Stavka meeting to defend his proposal. It was a dramatic scene in which his plan to carry out 2 simultaneous attacks was heavily criticized. In his memoirs, Rokossovsky wrote, "I was sent twice to the next room to consider the Supreme Command's comments, and each time I returned even more convinced that I was right." Finally, Stalin said, "The front commander's persistence proves that the offensive planning was carefully considered. It is a firm guarantee of success." Rokossovsky's proposal was given the green light. Vitebsk was under the control of General Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Army. But despite its impressive name, in 1944, the 3rd Panzer Army had almost no tanks left. General Reinhardt had started the war commanding the 4th Panzer Division, but replaced Hoth as commander of the 3rd Panzer Group during the Battle of Moscow in 1941. That year, his tanks came within 15 kilometers of the Russian capital. Army Group Center consisted of 4 armies, with a total force of about 1 million men. Operation Bagration would be the largest and best prepared Soviet operation of the war so far. If the Germans had discovered the preparations, they would have immediately reinforced the Belarus front. The forests and swamps already presented enough difficulties. German reinforcements would have been disastrous. Therefore, secrecy was of extreme importance. All troop movements took place only at night, under camouflage, without lights. White posts were placed at the roadside to keep drivers en route. Dump beds and hoods were painted white, so they could be seen by other vehicles. Units that had not reached their destination, by dawn, stopped immediately and began to camouflage their vehicles. A special pass was required to drive a vehicle during the day, and fewer than 100 passes were allocated to each army. Soviet aircraft flew over to inspect troop camouflage. If a pilot spotted a Red Army unit, he dropped a flag. This told the unit commander that his men could be seen from the air and that he needed to improve their camouflage. Security measures were enforced from top to bottom. Plans were hand-drawn by only 2 or 3 officers and taken to Stavka personally by the front commander. Around Vitebsk, it was decided not to bring tanks into the first phase of the attack. There was too much risk of detection. Red Army radio traffic disappeared. Russian units were notorious for poor radio discipline. But as one German observed, the Russians broke with tradition and observed complete radio silence. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers practiced crossing the swamps and forests of Belarus. Infantry soldiers learned how to cross swamps, how to swim, and how to navigate in the forests. Many made special shoes for swamps, so they could walk without sinking into the mud. They built rafts to transport machine guns, mortars, and light cannons across the swamps. Logs and fascines, bundles of tied twigs, were placed to create roads for vehicles. Meanwhile, supplies arrived by rail. Stavka ordered the troops to receive 5 times the normal load of ammunition for the offensive. This amount of shells, bullets, and grenades would require 6,500 railway cars for transport. In total, 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of fuel, and more than 500,000 tons of food and forage were delivered to the troops in Belarus. This meant that every day, 100 supply trains arrived at the front. It was impossible to completely conceal preparations of such magnitude, but the German High Command still believed the Soviet attack would occur in Ukraine. Field Marshal Bush, commander of Army Group Center, went on leave 3 days before the Soviet offensive. His army group, with 1 million men, was about to be attacked by the combined force of 4 Soviet fronts: 2.4 million soldiers, 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 5,300 aircraft. The final preparations for the offensive were left to the Red Army engineers. Both sides had laid large minefields in front of their lines. Now the engineers would have to crawl through these minefields and begin clearing safe corridors for the attack. They would have to work in darkness and silence, and they had only 2 nights to complete the work. The key element of any mine is the firing mechanism. Pressure on it makes the mine explode. Demining involves first locating the mine, then removing or disabling the firing mechanism, and then removing the disarmed mine to a safe location. Demining teams had to work quickly and silently. They knew a single mistake could cost them their lives. To save time, engineers removed only the detonators, leaving the mine itself in place. They also had to worry about German traps, including tripwires hidden in the tall summer grass. Both sides were forced to constantly refine and update their methods to face new threats or tricks created by the enemy. Step by step, the engineers made their way through this deadly landscape. In just 2 nights, they deactivated 34,000 mines. This was the final stage of preparation. Through these cleared corridors, the Red Army was now ready to launch one of the largest and most decisive operations in history. Final preparations were made for the Great Soviet Summer Offensive of 1944. A last-minute change in its schedule only increased expectations. Operation Bagration would begin on June 22nd, the 3rd anniversary of the German invasion. The offensive began on the northern flank, with probing attacks near Vitebsk. Here, infantry from the 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian fronts successfully took the German frontline trenches. By dusk, Soviet units were engaged all along the front, as the probing attacks gave way to a full-scale assault. Hundreds of aircraft arrived to drop bombs on the German front line. At dawn, the T-34s joined the attack. Swarms of Ilyushin ground attack aircraft crossed the front line with orders to hunt down and destroy German artillery batteries in the enemy rear. German heavy artillery was a feared opponent, capable of disrupting the entire offensive, but it was also extremely vulnerable to air attacks. In low-altitude strafing attacks, the IL-2s used machine guns, cannons, and rockets to decimate artillery crews and destroy ammunition stocks. The Ilyushin IL-2 was designed by Sergei Ilyushin from the Soviet Central Design Bureau. It became the most produced military aircraft of all time. The crew and engine were protected by armor. This was essential to protect them from small arms fire during low-altitude attacks at only 25 to 50 meters. The IL-2 was slow and therefore extremely vulnerable to attacks from German fighters. Thus, in the second half of the war, they always flew with fighter escorts. But in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it once was. The German Army Group Center had only 40 fighters available for air defense. Its troops were completely exposed to Soviet air attacks. Soviet ground attack aircraft, the Sturmovik, roamed freely across the battlefield, often dismissing their fighter escorts. Meanwhile, Hitler had conceived the idea of the fortress city. Troops defending places with this special status were supposed to fight to the last man, even when completely surrounded. One of these fortress cities was Vitebsk. The city was held by the 53rd Corps, part of General Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Army. After the first day of fighting, Reinhardt proposed withdrawing his forces from Vitebsk before they were encircled. But Field Marshal Busch relayed the Führer's order. The city was to be held at all costs. On the third day of battle, the Red Army properly encircled the 53rd Corps in Vitebsk. Only now, when it was too late, did Hitler authorize a withdrawal. But he still insisted that a division be left in Vitebsk, with orders to fight to the end. The desperate German attempt to escape the trap was doomed to failure from the start. The escape was led by the Luftwaffe's 4th Field Division, which reached the forests southwest of the city. There, it was subjected to overwhelming artillery and air attack, and was annihilated. After 5 days of combat, the 53rd German Corps capitulated. 17,000 survivors were captured, including the Corps commander, General Gallwitzer. The only German infantry division left in Vitebsk suffered a similar fate. The Red Army burst into the city, capturing the bridge over the western Dvina. The Germans tried to escape at the last minute, but were all killed or captured. Meanwhile, to the south, Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front began its attack toward the city of Bobroysk. It was here that Rokossovsky was attempting his controversial two-front attack, coming from the direction of Rogachev and the village of Parichi. Zhukov arrived to observe the assault by General Gorbatov's 3rd Army, with Rokossovsky driving the southern attack through the swamps and Zhukov coordinating the northern assault. A clear rivalry developed over who would be the first to break through the German lines. Near Rogachev, Soviet heavy bombers attacked under the cover of darkness. They were helped in finding their target by Red Army trucks, arranged in long lines, facing east with their headlights on. These lights, hidden from the Germans, guided the Soviet pilots to the target. In his memoirs, General Gorbatov wrote, "First, we heard the hum of light aircraft flying over to attack enemy positions. Then this noise was accompanied by the roar of heavy aircraft, wave after wave. Soon the enemy lines exploded in blasts and flames." At dawn, Soviet ground attack aircraft continued the bombardment. They strafed German trenches and bombed strongpoints with rockets and bombs. Soviet air attacks could be wild and inaccurate, but they also began to have a terrible psychological impact on German soldiers. Without Luftwaffe protection, they lived in almost constant fear of a sudden and deadly attack from the sky. Before the smoke cleared, Katyusha rockets and shells tore through the air. As the bombardment advanced, mine-clearing tanks began their push. Their heavy rollers detonated mines in their path, opening wide passages for the tanks and self-propelled guns that followed. Despite this massive attack by land and air, the Red Army continued to face fierce German resistance around Rogachev. But further south, in the village of Parichi, General Rokossovsky was steadily advancing through swamps and forests. Now he ordered General Pleyev's mechanized cavalry corps to advance to exploit the breach. Rokossovsky's bet on a two-front attack had paid off. He had made a breakthrough, and he did it before Zhukov. The only Panzer Division of Army Group Center was ordered to launch a counterattack near Rogachev, but at the last moment it received urgent new orders to move south to block Rokossovsky's advance. Many of its vehicles broke down on the difficult, swampy terrain. But Rokossovsky had widened the gap and was already sending fresh troops. A single panzer division would not stop him now. German defenses around Rogachow, deprived of their tank reinforcements and under the relentless blows of Zhukov, now collapsed. The 9th German Army was encircled. 2 days later, it surrendered. 20,000 Germans were taken prisoner. The Red Army's next objective was Minsk, the capital of Belarus. Its liberation would be led by General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. The plan was for Rotmistrov's tanks to advance rapidly along the Smolensk-Minsk highway. But attempts to capture Orsha along the route were bloodily repelled. Then the decision was made to launch the attack from near Vitebsk, where the Red Army had already broken through German defenses. The 5,000 vehicles of the 5th Guards Tank Army began their attack toward Borisov, deep in the rear of Army Group Center. For 2 days, their advance met virtually no resistance. Meanwhile, Hitler had dismissed Field Marshal Busch from command. His successor was Field Marshal Model, the so-called Führer's firefighter and master of defense. But he inherited a desperate situation. 3 Soviet fronts were advancing on Minsk. The Germans were in full retreat, hoping to reach the Berezina River. But the Red Army already controlled most of the crossing points. The Germans held only one bridge on the Minsk highway. Thousands of German vehicles, cars, and soldiers were now converging on the bridge. A German witness described the scene. The rush was most frantic near the bridge approaches. Cars and trucks tried to push each other off the road. Everyone wanted to be first to cross the bridge. There were fights and curses. The military police were powerless. And there was always the constant fear of an air attack. The ground attack Sturmovik aircraft relentlessly attacked the withdrawing columns of German troops. Increasingly, the situation began to resemble the summer of 1941. But now the roles were reversed. It was the Germans fleeing in terror and confusion under relentless attacks from above. And now they could expect neither truce nor mercy. As Army Group Center threatened to disintegrate, the Wehrmacht deployed its medium bombers into the battle. It was hoped they could halt the Soviet tank columns and gain some vital space for their own troops. But faced with Soviet air superiority, daytime attacks resulted in heavy losses for little gain. 1 week after the start of the offensive, German panzer divisions began arriving from Ukraine. The 5th German Panzer Division, reinforced with a battalion of Tiger tanks, prepared to face Rotmistrov's advancing army. The Tigers and Panthers slowed the Soviet advance to a bloody crawl. In July 1944, the 5th Guards Tank Army had not yet received the new T-34-85 tanks. This upgraded version had a much more powerful 85mm gun. Although this did not make them equal to a German Tiger or Panther tank, it made their encounters less one-sided. The tank battles lasted 2 days. The Red Army suffered enormous losses, but the strength of the German tanks was also reduced from 159 to only 18 tanks. The fate of Minsk was sealed. The Tigers and Panthers bought some time for Army Group Center, but they could not hold the entire front. At dawn on July 3rd, tanks of the 1st and 3rd Belarusian fronts entered Minsk from the north and southeast, encircling the remnants of 2 German armies. Meanwhile, the 2nd Belarusian front harassed the German retreat from the east. It took a week to eradicate German resistance within Minsk. The siege of Minsk resulted in the capture of another 35,000 prisoners, including 12 generals. By this time, Army Group Center had suffered catastrophic losses. 17 of its divisions were wiped out in just 2 weeks of fighting. Total German casualties were estimated at 409,000, of which 150,000 were prisoners. The German panzer divisions remained a potent weapon, but Army Group Center no longer had enough manpower to form a defensive line. Operation Bagration did not end until August 19th, when the Red Army reached central Poland, the border of East Prussia, and the Baltic Sea. 5 Soviet fronts, over a front more than 1,000 kilometers wide, advanced between 550 and 600 kilometers. The success of the operation exceeded the most optimistic expectations of the Stavka High Command. After Operation Bagration, Stalin began referring to Rokossovsky using both his first name and patronymic, Konstantin Konstantinovich. The only person he had previously honored in this way was Marshal Shaposhnikov, his most trusted general. The Soviet victory was so overwhelming that some foreign news agencies doubted the accuracy of the reports, so Stalin decided to prove it. He gave the order to start Operation The Great Waltz, named after a popular 1938 American film. Trains from Belarus began secretly arriving in Moscow. The central Moscow Hippodrome and Dynamo Stadium were cordoned off. On July 17th, it was announced to the public that German prisoners of war captured in Operation Bagration would be paraded through the streets of Moscow. Muscovites took to the streets to witness this strange spectacle. The procession was led by 19 German generals in full uniform. They were followed by over 1,000 officers. Behind them came columns of tired and bearded soldiers. This was what Stalin wanted the world to see: the fate of Adolf Hitler's once proud conquering army. The people of Moscow watched, mostly in silence. In the minds of many, the German soldier had become almost completely dehumanized. The Soviet people had been subjected to relentless propaganda, but they had also suffered terrible and brutal losses. For many, the German soldier was a fascist beast, responsible for murder and rape, and for burning villages and towns. 57,000 German prisoners were paraded through the city on their way to labor camps in the east. The procession was followed by street cleaners, washing away all traces of the hated fascists. This impressive display made a great impact on Muscovites and foreign observers, as was its intention. Now, no one doubted the victorious conclusion of the war. The collapse of the German Army Group Center allowed the Red Army to continue its advance toward Poland and East Prussia. In the Baltic region, the advance was led by General Bagramyan's 1st Baltic Front and General Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front. On July 8th, Chernyakhovsky's troops reached the outskirts of Vilnius. The city was soon surrounded, and after 5 days of fierce house-to-house fighting, the garrison laid down their arms. On July 31st, the commander of his 8th Mechanized Brigade sent a radio message to the Corps headquarters reporting, "We are on the shore of the Gulf of Riga." This short radio message meant something incredible. All German forces in the Baltic were now isolated. The commander's report was so unexpected that his corps commander asked him to repeat it. Then he gave him the following unusual order: fill 3 bottles with seawater, seal them, and have the commander personally sign to confirm that the water was taken from the Baltic Sea. Then send the bottles to the Corps headquarters. The bottles of seawater were delivered to the front headquarters by aircraft, and from there sent to Moscow. They were on their way to Stalin. Soon, the bottles were on a table in the Kremlin, as proof that Soviet tanks had reached the sea. Operation Bagration had shattered the Eastern Front. Now the Red Army was moving in the Baltic. The next stop was Tallinn. The Estonian capital was the target of Red Army units from the 8th Estonian Rifle Corps, under the command of Lieutenant General Pern. He organized a motorized column that covered 100 kilometers in a day. His men stormed Tallinn and captured the city on September 22, 1944. Only the German Army Group North remained, trapped in the Courland Peninsula. Despite repeated requests from General Guderian, now chief of the General Staff, Hitler refused to allow the troops to be evacuated from Courland. The German pocket in Courland was described as an armed prisoner of war camp. The troops trapped there ceased to have any influence on the course of the war. The Courland Army Group finally laid down their arms on May 11, 1945, 2 days after Germany's surrender. The Red Army had reached the border of East Prussia. It was here, in Königsberg, that the remnants of Army Group Center had withdrawn after defeat in Belarus. The shattered German formations had received new recruits and new armaments. The Red Army could not safely bypass such a potential hornet's nest, nor was the prospect of a long siege appealing to the Stavka. The decision was made to isolate East Prussia with an attack to the north, toward East Pomerania, heading for Danzig on the Baltic coast. Then resistance in East Prussia would be methodically broken. It would be difficult. Many German units now fought fanatically to defend Germany from the wrath of the Red Army. The task of breaking through to the Baltic was entrusted to Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front. He attacked on January 14, 1945. But just 1 day after the offensive began, the weather turned for the worse. The artillery fired blindly into the snowstorm. The infantry advance was slow, only 3 or 4 kilometers on the first day. The Germans reinforced their defense with Tiger tanks and Sturmgeschütz assault guns. General Reinhardt, now in command of Army Group Center, still hoped to launch an armored counterattack to contain the Soviet advance. But his tanks were sent south to face more Soviet offensives on the Vistula. Reinhardt could only count on the elite Panzergrenadier Division Grossdeutschland. When his advance began, he faced 500 Soviet tanks from the front reserve. In 1945, the T-34 was the Red Army's main tank. It retained many features of the earlier T-34, such as excellent mobility and reliability. The main improvement was a powerful 85mm gun housed in a larger 3-man turret. The crew size was increased to 5. About 80,000 of these tanks were produced by the USSR before production finally ended in 1950. They remained in service with many armies a long and bitter road to victory. It all began many kilometers to the east, in 1943, when Soviet troops prepared to cross the Dnieper River. Ahead of them was the Battle of Ukraine. Thank you very much for watching this video until the end. If you feel that channel has added a lot to you, please consider supporting by subscribing to the channel. May God bless you all and see you soon.